God made sure they saw you at your worst. That was the light they couldn't ignore. Amen. There is a kind of light nobody talks about. Not the light of success, but the light of exposure. The light that shows up when you have nowhere to hide anymore. When life has stripped you down so far that even your private struggles become visible. Joblessness becomes visible. Financial pressure becomes visible. Loss becomes visible. Family tension becomes visible. Marriage breaking down becomes visible. Possessions being removed one by one until there is nothing left to pretend with. And God says that was the light, not because you wanted it, but because you could not escape it. You couldn't hide anymore. You couldn't cover it anymore. You couldn't manage appearances anymore. Everything started speaking for you. Even your silence was loud. Even your struggle was obvious. Even your pain carried weight in the atmosphere around you. And people started seeing it, not just friends, but enemies too. The ones who used to ignore you suddenly had access to your lowest season. The ones who never checked on you before suddenly became aware of your situation. The ones who once doubted you now had front row access to your process. And you didn't understand it at the time, but God says that was intentional. Amen. Psalms chapter 23 verse 5 says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Because this is what you didn't see. That attention was not random. It was spiritual positioning. Your life became a stage. Your struggle became visible, and your enemies were not just watching you fall. They were being invited to witness what God was about to do next. Amen. Because when you were at your lowest, you were not hidden in shame the same way you thought. You were exposed in assignment. And yes, it felt like shame. It felt like embarrassment. It felt like people could finally see everything you were trying to hold together. Amen. But God says that was not exposure for destruction. That was exposure for demonstration. Because even your faith didn't make sense to people. You kept believing when nothing was working. You kept praying when nothing was changing. You kept trusting when everything was collapsing, and people around you started questioning your sanity. Amen. How are they still holding on like this? Don't they see what is happening? If they were so right with God, why is this happening to them? But what they didn't understand is that kind of faith in a low place becomes part of the light. Because now your life is not just being watched for your struggle. It is being watched for your response. And that response is what drew attention in the spirit. And now hear this clearly. The enemy does not celebrate random pain. He celebrates what he thinks is final outcome. So when everything started falling apart in your life, some voices started celebrating too early. They thought they were witnessing your end. They thought they were watching your collapse. They thought your silence meant surrender. But God says they were actually being invited to a table they did not understand. Because the table is not always comfort. Sometimes the table is observation. Amen. Sometimes the table is exposure. Sometimes the table is God saying, watch closely what I'm about to do with this life. And now here's the truth you are only seeing in hindsight. You were not just going through loss. You were being positioned where no one could deny what happens next. Because when God lifts you from that kind of place, there is no confusion about who did it. And this is where God shows He's not predictable. Amen. Because suddenly, out of nowhere, help shows up in ways nobody can explain. Amen. A shift that arrives so suddenly, even you pause and ask, what just happened? It confuses everyone around you. Even the same people who watched you at your lowest. Because the help does not match your situation. It does not match your history. It does not match your resources. It only matches one thing: the hand of God in your life. And that is how everyone realizes you were never standing alone in that season. You were with God. Amen.